What I'm going to take you through now is a walkthrough of the product strategy board. This board was created as guardrails to help you come up with that final strategy. Many product managers I work with and I coach don't know where to start, and they don't know how to go from where they are today to coming up with that final strategy. They may know or seen product strategy templates, ones like my one, but they don't know how to actually facilitate their thinking and get themselves to actually that final strategy at the end. So this board was created to help do just that. Now, if you're really good at strategy, you've got a good process around strategy, then by all means stick with what you have. You can probably learn a bit from this and take what you can from it and amend your process. But by all means stick with your process if that works well for you. But if you're like the many product managers I work with and I coach and you don't know where to start, this is a starting point and it's going to help guide your thinking. But I want to caution you here, like as always, this is not meant to be a checkbox activity. You still need to put the work in, you still need to do the research, you still need to do the thinking. And by all means, if some of these boxes and some of these placeholders that I have created inside this template, if some of them don't make sense to you, or you don't understand them, or they don't make sense in your context, then change them. If the things you would like to add, then add them by all means. I want you to pay particular attention as to why the process is set out this way. Some of the first principles that have gone behind thinking about some of the placeholders in there, so that you have a better understanding as to what the actual first principles are for building a product strategy, and also give you a greater understanding as to why things are the way that they are. And when you do decide to make any amendments, which I encourage that you do, you then have that ground foundation of knowledge and you know how to do that. So, on that note, let's walk through the board. Let me walk you through each one of these steps. What you'll see on the board immediately is that there is the blank template along the top here. So there's 4 steps. I'm going to walk you through all of them. I have this underneath where we have the diagnosis, coherent guide and policy, and then set of coherent actions, which mirrors the book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and Richard Rumelt's process of basically saying that the kernel of a strategy is these 3 things: a diagnosis, a guide and policy, and a set of coherent action. What you'll then see underneath that is a worked example. So this is actually an example. I stuck with the Tesla example. So we talked about the Tesla example when I walked you through an example, the product strategy document. So I thought that I'll stick with the same worked example here. Keep in mind as you go through this example, this is intended to be cursor 2006 when Elon Musk wrote that blog post about the 3-step master plan. I do have some data and metrics in there that is obviously more recent data and metrics than back then. And that's because that's the data that I could grab today. But you can imagine that we would have had just 2006 versions of those datas. But I tried my best to stick with 2006 information as much as possible, but it's a worked example. The intent is not too much about the content and the precision of the content or whether you like Tesla or Elon Musk or not. The idea behind it is just to give you a worked example so you can see how some of these sections look and how some of these tools can actually play out as we actually go through them. So on that note, let's go back up to the top and let's start with section 1, which is inputs. So section 1 is inputs. And the reason why it's inputs is because this is where we need to start with strategy. Strategy starts with, as it says here, gathering data and gathering inputs. And that's because great strategies aren't just made up. They don't just, we don't just make assumptions and believe we have all the answers. Great strategies are informed. They're informed and they're backed by data and research. So what you're not going to get inside of this is actually going and doing that research. But what this is going to prompt you to do is actually to then go and do that research. So for example, if you don't know what the market and industry trends are or what the competitive landscape looks like, then you need to go and do that research first. Go and do that research and then put that information in here in this template. So we want to gather data. And then the question becomes, well, what type of data do we want to gather? Really, the answer to that question is any data that is pertinent to your product. Now that's really broad. So for me, the way that I break this down, and you'll see similarities between this and my product strategy document, no surprise there, because those two things, this and that strategy document, are designed to work together. And I've broken this down into basically inputs and information on the market, inputs and information on the business, inputs and information on your product. Now, I've further broken this down to give you even more guardrails around it and to help you even more. But when we think about the market, we want to think about things like, well, what's the market and industry look like? What trends are happening? Are there certain trends that are going on? Is the market growing? Is it declining? Those types of things. We don't want to look at the competitive landscape, like who are our competitors? What are they doing? Do some competitive analysis. Who are the new players? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Those types of things. And then finally, we want to also look at the people that make up our market and our industry. We want to look at our users. We want to look at things like market segmentation. What are those segments? What are their jobs to be done? All those types of things. Are there interesting data points around our users and how they're using our product, how they're engaging with our competitors, what their hopes and concerns are, jobs to be done, all of those types of things. Then we get down to the business, and I've broken this down into essentially gathering some key informations about our company, like what is our vision? What are our goals if we have them? What is our company strategy? How has our company performed recently? Are we growing? Are we shrinking? What products are going well? What products aren't? Those types of things. Maybe even some user feedback here or brand perception, those types of things. And then a final section around opportunities or any significant events. Like, did we get fined recently or in trouble in the news? Or did we just raise Series F funding or something like that? And then when we get down to the product, it looks very similar to that, just with a little bit more detail. We start to look at what our product vision is, what our current goals are or previous goals have been. If we do have an existing product strategy, what is that product strategy? This is also a great template to review your existing strategy, so to go through it. What is our unique value proposition? How has our product performed? What is that performance? Is it growing? What are customers using? What are they not using? How's churn? How's retention? All those types of things. What are some of the key customer feedback or user feedback that we're hearing and we're picking up on? What are some of those verbatim quotes? What are some of the things we think are working? What are some of the things we think aren't working? And what opportunities, or again, maybe even some significant events that have happened to our product? So what we're doing here is we're just information gathering, right? So we're still in the diagnosis phase. We are just gathering inputs on the market, the business, and the product. And this should just be data. So if you look at the worked example below, you'll see that it is just data. So I've put some market trends in there. Like, okay, sustainability initiatives are growing, clean energy is growing. We've looked at things like carbon emissions from the Toyota Prius to the Roadster. We've done some SWOT analysis on the industry. What do we think our strengths are, our weaknesses are, opportunities and threats? And we've done a pestle analysis as well. So that political, environmental, economical, social, legal, technology as well analysis. And what are some of those, and this is a very important tool too. And I like doing this here because it can give you a broad view of like, well, what are some of those legal implications or political implications that we might not already be considering? Equally, you'll see here with the competitive landscape, we've done a competitors map. We've done a competitive analysis. We've used tools like Porter's 5 forces. We've done a perceptual map. We've done jobs to be done, prioritization, some market segmentation. The business, we've done business performance, business mission, strategy, principles, etc., etc. And to help you do all of that, I have added, because you might be thinking, where do I start with some of these? Like you just mentioned pestle analysis. I've never heard of that before. I wouldn't know to use a pestle analysis here. Well, to help, in each of these sections, I have added a little section on the side underneath the description, a set box that contains tools you might consider using here. So for here, I've broken it down. Here's the market analysis stuff. Here's some competitive analysis tools that, these are all tools that I've used in the past, and these are all tools that are useful to use here. So you're not flying blind. I've tried to give you as much, help and information and links as possible. As a lot of these templates, I tried to find Miro templates as much as possible, so you can just basically click on it and add it straight into the template. Here's some for user research. and a product scorecard, which will be in there. It's just a placeholder for now, but it'll be in there on the final version. Okay, so now we've gotten some inputs. We gathered a whole bunch of data. What do we do with that data? Well, data is only meaningful if we can draw away insights from that data. So in order to do that, what we want to come out with next is essentially this notion of a narrative. Now, I've talked about this notion before when we talked about our product strategy document. Some of you might have heard me talk about it in other videos and other things like that. But the idea behind this is to build key narratives around each of those sections. So what is happening in the market, what is happening in our business, and what is happening with our product? And what are those insights, and what are the things that we then believe to be true going forwards? So narratives are important because they are a mixture of what data and information do we have on the past, as well as what is our hypothesis for the future. Try to bring these two things together. That is what I'm talking about here as a narrative. So in order to do that, we're going to start with insights. We're going to then formulate hypotheses, and then we're going to build our narrative. So to start with, we start with insights. Now, what we need to do with insights is we need to filter the signals from the noise. So there's this notion of signals versus noise. So we get a lot of information in, and a lot of it could be noise, and some of them are important signals. So this is what we want to do. We want to look at all the data that we had in step one, and we want to start to just filter it. What are the important signals that we think are really important that we should be paying attention to? And what are the things that we think we can just ignore? From there, we want to take the signals and we want to start to think about, well, what are the key insights that we can draw from these signals? So I'll give you an example. So if we go down below the Tesla example, so we said like hydrogen cars, noise, hybrid tech, maybe just noise. But some strong signals might be things like that there is a strong, you might not be able to read that, I'll zoom in. There is a strong investment and growth inside renewable energies. So what does that mean? One insight that we might draw from that would be that the focus on sustainability has been growing and it will continue to grow. Just like there is an increased focus from the government on things like sustainability, which means that there could be laws around carbon emissions, and those things will open the door for EVs. So these are some of the insights that we're drawing from there. So we'll go back up. Once we have those insights, we then want to start to formulate hypotheses. Again, these are hypotheses about, based on the data, what do we believe is going to be true in the future and why? And I've got a format for you to do this, but feel free to not follow this format if it doesn't make sense to you. But this format is just to help you if you need it. And the format is, we believe X because of Y and therefore blah. So the way that this should work is, we believe something to be true because of the data, and therefore this will happen in the future. Again, let's go through an example. So we believe that the sustainability industry will continue to grow exponentially. We believe this because of the changes in laws and the climate around, the political climate around sustainability. So there's been, they've been more receptive to it, they've been more focused on it, and a change in social norms. And we get a whole bunch of data that suggests all of these things. And therefore, there is a need for more sustainable alternatives will increase over time. So the need for more sustainable alternatives will increase. So thinking more generically there, but if you think about this in the context of transportation, then the need for sustainable transport is going to increase. It's only going to increase in the future. Another thing we might believe to be true is that development costs to create an EV will be extremely high. We believe this because there is a high entry cost into building cars. We have data on that. We also know that there's a lot of R&D necessary for new technology. So that's just a first principle that we know about. Therefore, we're going to require a large amount of funding and a good amount of cash flow initially to be able to do this and make this a viable business, and et cetera, et cetera. Right? So we're going to build those hypotheses. A great example here, just to tell a quick story, Jeff Bezos was interviewed back with Amazon, And he tells a story about one of the reasons why he decided to start Amazon and where he got the idea from. And it was when he was working at his job, he heard a crazy statistic. There was something like, and don't quote me on this, but it was like the internet is growing by like over 3,000% a year or something like that.
Where did you get an idea for Amazon.com?
Well, 3 years ago, I was in New York City working for a quantitative hedge fund when I came across the startling statistic that web usage was growing at 2,300% a year. So I decided I would try and find a business plan that made sense in the context of that growth.
So you can see here that he would say something like, well, we believe that the future is going to be on the internet. More people are going to have access to it. And the way that we shop is going to become more, e-commerce is going to become a thing. And we know this to be true because the internet has grown by 3,000% a year. And therefore, if we offered an e-commerce solution, that will continue to grow and be able to ride that wave. So just an example of how this hypothesis works. From there, we now have hypotheses about the data and what we think is going to be true in the future. And we want to just package all of this up into some narratives around the market, the business, and the product. Again, I've got a format that you can follow and you can use here. This format is extremely helpful. It's just basically what the data is, the problem, the diagnosis. And remembering we're in the diagnosis phase. But as I show in the example below, you can just write a paragraph, all right? So state of the market, green energy and sustainability market is growing exponentially by X% per year. You can put the data in there. We expect this growth to increase in the future as more governments increase their focus on climate change and introduce new laws and sustainability targets. This puts fossil fuels square in the crosshairs, and we know that the transport industry emits X amount of CO2 into the atmosphere per year, and the industry has had very few innovations over the years to move away from fossil fuels. With technological leaps inside battery technologies, we believe that EVs are finally within reach, and with such an incumbent industry, it is right for disrupting, and we believe that doing so can accelerate the industry towards a more sustainable future. However, building cars is not cheap, etc. But you can see how that kind of pans out there. So that's what we want to do. We want to have these narratives. Now, again, I'm not leaving you blind either. There's some links here that you can look at as well, some tools you might use here. But the intent is to take the data, to formulate insights based on that data, to formulate hypotheses around the future, and then to come up with some key narratives about what is happening. Now, these narratives become your diagnosis on the situation as well as part of your guiding policy, and they're going to guide your decisions. Like these narratives and these constraints that you're creating and these things that you believe to be true are going to guide the decisions that you make, which is what leads us into the next two sections, which is all about your levers and then actually making those strategic choices. Now, to try and get us towards strategic choices, we want to start to think about those narratives and we want to start to model these narratives out. So this is a little bit of some free form space. And the intent behind it is to just think about, well, based on these narratives, what are some of the choices we might make? And let's model some of these choices out. If we did option A and we did option B, how would that look? If we did this option, how would that kind of feed another option? We might also do something like a KPI tree here, which says, well, if we want to get X, what are all the lever points that we could have that we could influence in order to get X? And what we're starting to model out is, okay, if we want to get X, there's 4 different avenues we can take. Okay, let's explore each of these avenues. Which avenue makes the most sense? And this is the intent behind this area. And I've added a little section at the top here, which is about product principles, which you can throw your principles in there if you have them or if you have similar. And the idea is that plus your narratives are going to be the things that really guide your thinking in this section. Sorry to interrupt, but I just got off a call with a product leader. We talked about this exact section, and there's a few things that were worth emphasizing here. The first thing I want to just talk about is the fact that you've got to be realistic about the choices you're making here, and you've got to be realistic about the challenges surrounding those choices. So what I mean by that is you've got to be realistic about the constraints that you have, that the product has, that the business has around those choices. It's not just about modeling the upside of these choices. You need to look at, well, what is going to stop us from being able to do it? Or what are the negative consequences that we might run into if we did do this choice, and really weigh up those pros and cons. And again, really bring in those constraints of the business. In fact, you could argue that it's more important in this section to actually talk about what could go wrong and why you can't do something than all of the upsides and what can go right and all the benefits and how we actually going to do it. Alex Hormozi had this recent interview on Modern Wisdom, and he actually talked about this. He actually talked about how when his businesses and when he works inside his portfolio companies, when they're trying to make really big strategic decisions, rather than thinking about the upside, they actually focus on all of the problems. And rather than asking yourself, well, which one has the bigger upside? They end up, he frames it differently by thinking about, well, which problem would we prefer?
But when we're making big strategic decisions, we say like, which problems would we prefer? And so rather than talking about like the gains and what's the upside, if we have like, let's say we're going to make a big investment in software for this company, or we're going to make a big, a new service line, or we're going to just decide to develop a physical product, right? I mean, I know you were literally on the just back half of a big decision like this yourself. It's like, okay, let's imagine what the problems are going to be if we decide to do this new service category. Well, some people are going to complain that they're not getting results from this thing. We're going to have a ton, we might have some negative reviews in the short term that we're going to have to deal with. Like, let's look at what happens when one of our favorite customers tell us to fuck off. Let's really sit in what each of these problems is. And then when we spell out all of the problems and we don't even think about the upside, say, which of these problems do we prefer and which are we more equipped to deal with?
I see this all the time inside companies and even inside their strategies. Sometimes they have strategies, and when you look at it, they're overly optimistic. They are very focused on the upside, and I don't want to say they're ignorant of the challenges or the real constraints that they have, but what they haven't done is they clearly haven't invested the time and done the due diligence to actually explore what those constraints are, what challenges they're going to run into, and they haven't really built a strong enough strategy to explain how they're going to overcome those challenges. And perhaps I'll just leave you on one example that we talked about on that call, just to make this really actionable to you before we just bring it back. One of the things that the product leader was really grappling with was inside their business strategy. So we're looking at the business strategy and we're talking about product strategy, but inside the business strategy, they had a pillar that was to hire the best people. Now, this sounds great. We all want to do that, right? Like, we all want to hire the best people. And they had a whole bunch of narrative around the rationale as to why hiring good people would be beneficial to the business. They had a bit of a rudimentary flywheel that was attached to it, explaining how that was all going to work and tie into some of the other strategic themes that they had. But to give you some context, they are a small startup. And more specifically, they are a bootstrapped startup. So it's great for them that they're profitable. But being very small, also being self-funded, so they don't have this huge bucket of external funding, what this means is that they actually don't have the revenue in order to pay top talent salaries. And the product leader was well aware of this, something that she herself had grappled with. And so whilst it sounds great to say we want to hire the best people, and here's the reason why, here's how it's going to benefit and feed into these other themes. So there was coherence there. It's a nice ambition, but if you look at the constraints of the business, it's really just wishful thinking. And unless you actually sit down and look at those constraints and say, okay, we can't pay top dollar, so what can we do instead? And come up with a plan and a coherent set of actions and some choices as to how you're actually going to overcome that to still, achieve that thing. It's just wishful thinking. And you might be better off actually looking at it and saying, let's be realistic here. We're not in a position today to hire top talent. We hope to be in a different position in the future, but today the constraints of the business means that we can't do this. So we cannot make this as a choice. We need to make different choices, and we really just need to make that trade-off today. So what I want to just highlight here is be realistic about the challenges, be realistic about the constraints. In fact, arguably you want to focus more on those things during this section. And if you do so, you will avoid your strategy being wishful thinking, and you will be more honest, it'll be more realistic, and therefore it'll be a better strategy as a result of it. Okay, that's all I wanted to cover. I thought I'd squeeze this in the final edits before I push it out because I thought it was pertinent and it was a worthwhile story to tell. Let's get back to the Miro board and the strategy process and finish it off. Again, there's a whole bunch of tools you can use here. I'll show you some example that I did around Tesla and some of the things that you might think about here. So again, starting to model it out, right? So what are our potential target markets? Well, we got these three, market segments. Let's model it out. Well, the top market is going to be less price sensitive, means we can charge a higher price, gives us a greater chance to be profitable. We know we can use that profit to fund R&D, which means that it's going to be a positive, net positive scenario there. Scenario number 2 or 3 would be to tackle one of these markets. Unfortunately, we cannot charge that high price point if we did go after these markets. Therefore, we're likely to not be profitable, which means we're going to have to rely on further funding. And additional funding will be split between supporting our first product as well as subsequent future products and R&D. And we could argue that maybe that is not actually the path that we want to go down, and that doesn't actually make sense for us. Other things we might model here is like, well, what does it look like? And this is a Wardley map. You can read about it. This is actually one from Simon Wardley. This is an example, just happens to be that he uses EVs as an example when he's trying to teach Wardley maps. But we could think about, well, what does it look like if EVs are being introduced to the market? What impact does that have? And we start to see things like, well, we need to consider charging solutions. We need to do R&D not just in battery technology and not just into the car, but also into the charging infrastructure and the charging technology. And this could be a big barrier to adoption. And it also presents an opportunity that maybe a future charging network could be a moat. So we're parking that thought, maybe not for the current strategy, but maybe for a future consideration and a future strategy as well. Other things we might look at is like, well, how much range do we need to have? We might be looking at cost versus benefit. We might also be looking at like the flywheel. How do we build a flywheel around that? And in a way, the master plan, the 3-step master plan is a flywheel. It's an internal flywheel. It's not so much of a customer flywheel, but it's an internal flywheel where one product feeds the next product, which feeds the next product, and so forth. So you can model all these things out. But like I said, this is very free form. It's going to be very dependent on your narratives, your context, and some of the things you're thinking about. But we want to model those things out. We want to start to think strategically. Well, this is the brainstorming part, right? Like if we did this or we did that, what are the pros and cons and how does that look? Once we start to model these things out and we start to model out those narratives, we start to model out those constraints, we do things like, KPI trees and that type of stuff, we can start to make choices. We can start to circle things on this and say, well, if we had a KPI tree, well, let's tackle this lever. Let's, tackle this problem, and that's going to help us drive towards that ultimate outcome that we want. And once we start to make those choices, we then get into the final section, which is finally, bringing our strategy home and bringing it together. So what we want to do at the end is we want to make those strategic choices. What choices are we making inside of our strategy? And to help facilitate that, I've got a format here, which is based on like a strategic theme. You could call it strategic initiative, strategic item, strategic choice, whatever you want to call it. They're all really labels for the same thing. But the idea is, what is that choice you're making? Give it a title. What is it? Who are we targeting with it? Why do we believe we should do it? How does it support our business strategy and our goals? Some further details on how we will achieve this and how we're going to measure progress and success. And you can use OKRs there as well. Again, I've got some tools over on the side here that you can look at that are going to help you be able to think about this and really firm up that strategic choice. So examples down the bottom as well. Again, the example only has 2 choices here. And I think the thing that I would highlight here is whilst I've given 4 placeholders, less is often more. A focus strategy is a very powerful strategy. Your choices should be coherent, as it says here, coherent action, right? And even when we look at other definitions of a strategy, strategies are coherent. So each of these themes need to complement and work with each other's. having just a bunch of sporadic and disparate things here, list of things to do, is not a strategy, and it is not an effective strategy. What should have happened so far is you should have cohesion between the narrative and the data and what you believe is going to happen, why it's happening. You should be looking at what those bets are and those lever points are, and you should be looking at how they work together. And then those choices at the end of the day should therefore be coherent. They have to be coherent with each other's. So the example that I give here with Tesla is obviously there's the first product offering, which is the sports car, but also R&D to lower costs. And those two things go together because remember, we're going to do a sports car and charge a high price for it so we can get profits and we can fund those profits into R&D so we can lower production costs on the future products and so forth. The flywheel, as we put over here, continues. So coherence, right? They need to be coherent with each other's. But that's it. You'll come up with some strategic choices. And then if you wish, you can package all of this up into that product strategy document, put it into that document, put it into the product strategy on a page, one page of summary for people as well to help communicate it. And then you have your product strategy. So hopefully that was useful for you. Just as a very quick recap, we want to start with data and inputs. We need to get information in. We need to take insights from that information. We want to model those insights into narratives, essentially hypotheses about what we believe is going to be true in the future and what some of our constraints are. We then want to model those things out as levers. We want to look at, well, what are our possible choices? What constraints do we have? What can we do? What can't we do? We want to overlay things like our brand and our principles and our values inside of that. And then we want to make some choices. And those choices need to be coherent. And that is the process of coming up with a product strategy. As I mentioned before, don't let this become a checkbox activity. Please amend it. Please, tweak it to your context and your needs. And please use some of these tools that I've put down there. There's a whole bunch of guiding tools that can help you do that. And, this is perhaps one of the hard parts about strategy is I can't just say, do this. It's like get information on the market, but how you go about going and getting that information, whether you do a competitive analysis or not, is kind of up to you and based on your context. I can't tell you that that is the right thing to do or not. Maybe you should do it, maybe you shouldn't. And sometimes only doing it is the only way to work out whether it's valuable or worthwhile doing or not. So that's it. That's a product strategy board. I hope you got value out of this. And if you want to learn more about product strategy, check out the product strategy course over on Product Pathways, where we go through product strategy in detail. We walk through what is product strategy, how to formulate a product strategy. We go through that product strategy document, and we go through some of those strategic levers you can pull, like flywheels, moats, and unique value propositions, so you can make your strategy bulletproof. Check out the Miro board over on Miro. There's a link in the description to it. I hope you find it very valuable and useful. I hope you get a lot of value out of it. And thanks for watching and thanks for all the support. I'll see you at the next one.